Hello and welcome to the Good Life podcast with me, Sabine Pusch.
And me, Robert Keeling.
And it's another lovely spring day and we're in another beautiful park. And this time we're talking about a subject that's very close to your heart, isn't it, Rob? So why don't you introduce our guest and our subject?
Well, thank you, Sabine. So in previous podcasts, we've talked about what the so-called good life looks like in major cities, and we've compared London and Berlin. It's always struck me that a successful city is one which should welcome outsiders and potentially offer them sanctuary. And different European cities have found different ways to welcome and accept asylum seekers and refugees. And as we're going to be talking about, London and Berlin have got quite different approaches at times. But I thought it'd be really nice to introduce a friend of mine, Sydney Sofa, who's going to offer us a really interesting perspective on London.
Hi, my name is Sydney Sofa. I'm the operations manager for London for a charity called Care for Calais, which supports refugees and asylum seekers across the UK and in northern France as well.
And how is it you got to know Sydney?
Well, I've been volunteering for Care for Calais for a few years now, and I've got very interested in what the situation's like in London for hotels. And then as a contrast, I was based in Berlin for the first 6 months of 2022 and got stuck in with various refugee and community groups there. So I saw firsthand how Berlin was able to rise to that challenge, and it struck me that might be sort of an interesting comparison to make there.
Can you just explain what that challenge was in 2022, please?
Well, it was a major influx of a very large number of Ukrainians, of course, and I think this is maybe a useful sort of opening point on this. A city's geography really determines a lot about the sorts of people that are going to arrive there, and Berlin, being where it is in eastern Germany, was all of 2 days rail travel from central Ukraine, and that put it very much on the front line, in contrast to in 2015 when large numbers of Syrians arrived in Europe, which affected more cities like Munich in the south.
So can you explain what you do with Care for Calais?
Yeah, so Care for Calais was set up in 2015 in Calais in northern France to support displaced people who are kind of living on the French-British border there, and essentially people who are trying to come across to the UK. We had a sort of direct aid operation there to supply things like clothing, sleeping bags, food, tents, all manner of things, people who are essentially sort of sleeping rough there. We set up our UK operation 2020, and we have sort of networks of volunteer groups across the country that provide, again, that direct aid to people seeking asylum in the UK. That mostly looks like English classes, activities, toiletries. We do sort of like trips, cultural support, but also a lot of sort of one-on-one advice and support. So not legal advice, which is a kind of restricted area, but simple things like helping someone register for a GP or raise an issue about their accommodation. As a group, we mainly work with people who are living in home office run asylum hotels, which are often pretty poor quality, and there's a real lack of access to support, to legal support. And so we try and sort of bridge that gap of support and sort of walk alongside people as they kind of go through their journey of seeking asylum in the UK.
How did you get involved in it?
I, like Rob, actually also got involved as a volunteer. So when I moved to London and was doing my master's here, I wanted to get involved with something in it. I think the supporting displaced people had been something that I'd been thinking about a lot, and so I started as a volunteer for a couple of years, and then a job opening came up at the organisation, and I took it, and I've here a couple of years later now.
Rob, can you compare the two? Can you compare London and Berlin then?
Yeah, I'll try to. I think apart from their obvious different geographies and histories and so on and so on, a really interesting difference between the two cities is accommodation and the amount of space that is available. So a big option that's been decided for asylum seekers in the UK, and including London, has been the use of hotels. Berlin has some very large open spaces which have been repurposed. So one example is difgl Airport, which is in the north of the city. It used to be the major entry point to Berlin, and it was repurposed a few years ago to provide asylum accommodation with just large tents being put there. And although, this is, I think, an example where probably just the urban geography of the city makes the challenges really different. Another difference is in the jargon, the relationship between civil society and the state. And that basically means, how charities and NGOs and so on in Berlin rose to the challenge, so in 2015 as well, but more recently in 2022, and how they carry on working with the state to either in harmony or not in harmony There are some similarities and some really big differences, I think, between how Germany does stuff like that and how the UK does stuff like that.
Why is it that they're mostly housed in hotels here? Is there a particular reason?
Yeah, it's a really a good question. So back in the day, so sort of before 2020, there used to be a system of dispersal housing. So somebody might come to the UK, the asylum system itself was working a lot smoother, people weren't waiting for their claims as long, and so they might stay in the hotel, what is essentially called a contingency hotel. So it's kind of essentially an emergency measure for a couple of weeks and then move into some kind of dispersal housing, which is more like housing in a community, a bit like a council house, but often worse quality. I think in 2020, the build-up of asylum claims in the system, just that there have been people coming to this country and not enough investment from our perspective in the system. So there was a huge backlog of claims, coupled with the pandemic and the sort of need to house people. The use of these hotels has just skyrocketed, and since then, people have been living in hotels for a couple of years and sometimes longer. It's important to note that if you come to the UK, you can also support yourself if you have the funds for it, but a lot of the people seeking asylum in the UK don't have the funds for it. They're kind of are considered destitute by the government, and that's when the government has a duty to step in and provide accommodation. So that's why people end up living in hotels, and I think it just tends to be because it's a way to accommodate a large number of people in one go.
Have you seen a change in the way that people respond to refugees here in the UK?
I think it's an interesting question, because I think what came to mind when you asked that is thinking about the riots we had in summer 2024 and seeing the direct targeting of hotels that were housing people seeking asylum, and the kind of emotive response to that and the community response that came out of that there are a lot of sort of counter protests and communities coming together to support people seeking asylum, which was, I guess, in contrast to those that were directly attacking the hotels. So in that sense, I think that felt like a little bit of a line in the sand from my perspective, of people wanting to go, actually, that level of violence that we saw is not done in our name. We don't believe that. And there are so many sort of community groups and hardworking people at local authorities and others who are like doing a lot to support people seeking asylum and refugees across the UK, but in London specifically. But I still think like the narrative that you see in the media and that gets sort of spouted a lot is still very negative. And I think my perspective has always been that the average person in the UK is actually pretty welcoming towards someone seeking asylum, but it's the media that kind of portrays it as if people in the UK aren't, or that there's this sort of negative message spun about how many people are coming or about people being criminals when they get here, which is just obviously not the case.
Have you seen an increase in asylum seekers over recent years?
I wouldn't have the figures to hand, but I think there has been, it kind of responds to the crises that we see across the world. So as Rob was saying, like when the war in Syria first broke out, there was sort of an influx of people seeking asylum across Europe, but also in the UK. Similarly with the really awful civil war in Sudan, that has meant that a lot of people from Sudan have been coming to the UK. So it really responds to what's going on in the world and conflicts there are. I think the numbers have been like somewhat consistent, I think, in the last few years. I know the government does like publish lots of data on it where, they all claim that there's been more under this government or less under this government, but it all seems to me like there's a pretty consistent number of people coming, seeking safety here. To note on that as well, generally speaking, there aren't really any safe routes to get here. So there's a lot of, discussion in the media about people coming across in small boats in the Channel. And that is because you have to physically be in the UK to claim asylum. And aside from the Afghan resettlement scheme and the Ukrainian Homes to Ukraine scheme, there aren't really other ways for people seeking asylum from other places to safely get here and then claim asylum. And that's why we see things like the small boats crisis happening.
And how is it different in Berlin then, Rob?
For me, it's very much a product of geography. So Berlin is, of course, in the centre of Europe. Even before the Ukraine crisis, it really put Berlin on the front line almost. Migration routes through southern Europe had meant that it was easier for Syrians and Afghans and other nationalities. Syrians get a lot of the attention because of Merkel's famous pronouncement about welcoming them, but other nationalities have made it to Germany as well. And some of the migration routes through Italy and on to Germany are quite well established as well. But the obvious difference is that there isn't a sea route to Germany. That goes without saying. So that affects the dynamics quite a bit.
I mean, my perspective on it is just thinking about it from a historical perspective, that we forget that it wasn't actually that long ago that ethnic Germans were subject to the biggest ethnic cleansing in history. This is something that people don't know. And my mother actually remembers housing refugees in her home immediately after the war because they were all escaping from the horrors of the East, and every household in Germany was obliged, if they had more than a certain amount of square metres, to house refugees. So it's interesting that we've all forgotten that, and I just wondered if there's a difference between the Germans and the British in the way in which they view refugees because of the history, do you think?
And that's such an interesting area. I would say I mean, even going back a step further, a really interesting thing that Berlin and London have in common is a Huguenots. So Berlin there was a thing called the Edict of Potsdam, which was a big welcome from the German monarchy at the time to Huguenots, who were French Protestants, who were the first refugiés or the first refugees. And of course, many Huguenots made a life in Britain as well, in London, east of London particularly. And the centre of Berlin has a really pleasant area called Gendarmenmarkt, which has a French church and a very good Huguenot museum, if you really want to go have a deep dive on this. But on your point, Sabine, about more recent history, I mean, this is, to me, like really at the crux of things, and is certainly a big difference with the UK, in that, yes, a large number of Germans were essentially expelled or forced out of formerly countries occupied by the Nazis after the Second World War. For obvious reasons, this was a pretty sensitive and taboo subject, and arguably still is. In true German Berlin style, there is, of course, a lot of thought, and they call it working up through the past, sort of thinking that's gone on about this. And I would really recommend a museum. It's got a very long German name, which is called the Dokumentationszentrum. And it goes on, it's got a very long name, but a documentation centre for forced displacement in the centre of Berlin. And Dr. Andreas Kossert, he's a leading historian on this, I've met him a bunch of times, and he's given me a really interesting description about how he felt it was right to develop a public museum to this theme, and then also contrast it with the history of more recent newcomers going back to the 90s. And that's, as ever with Berlin, there's a historic kind of fascinating history sort of thing there to explore. But how that compares to the UK and our sort of relationship with our past, I think is a more interesting question. I don't know. Sydney, do you have any?
Yeah, I think sometimes you kind of hear it, people talk about, like kinder transport and the sort of history we have in the UK of welcoming people that were seeking refuge from war. And I think the thing I always come back to with that is I'm thinking about the contemporary example of the way that refugees from Ukraine are being treated versus refugees from other parts of the world, and thinking that, who do we see as welcome here? Who do we see as sort of one of us or similar enough like us that we would welcome them here? And I think, yeah, I find that an interesting thing to consider. And I'd be interested to think about how in Berlin and in Germany, the way that Ukrainian refugees versus other refugees are being treated, and kind of what that says about society more broadly and kind of values.
To add to that, I think a really, big difference is that because of its past, many Germans, and I would still say most Germans, feel a need to demonstrate positive behaviours towards newcomers. Although the AfD and the rise of the AfD has attracted a lot of attention, there's still a really solid bedrock in German culture, which is thinking very clearly and profoundly about what the relationship between countries should be and people who come seeking sanctuary. I think in the UK, I don't think it's better or worse particularly, but it's something probably we've been forced to think about a bit less. We've done a little bit less soul-searching about our past, because probably haven't needed to as much, and maybe that has some impact on everyday attitudes. But I think I'd really like to just quickly talk about two what I think are just really great community-based organisations in Berlin, which have made particular efforts to reach out to local people. So you've got in any city, there's a need to provide humanitarian support as people come in dire circumstances, and then in the longer term, then you really need to help those people lay down roots, but also explain to people around them what's happened. And there are two I really like. So one is Ulmer 35 or Ulmer 35, which is in the west of the city, and one is called Kulturmarkthalle, Cultural Market Hall, in the east of the city, which is run by the great and amazing Ludger Lemper. Does a lot of cultural events, music events and so on, and it's in quite a scruffy bit of Pankow in the east. They make a real effort to try and make a kind of cultural impact locally. Ulmer 35 from 35, where I know the similarly amazing Armai von Hülsen-Pönsgen. Sorry, Armai, if you're listening, I still can't pronounce your surname properly. Is in a slightly swankier bit of town in the west, in Charlottenburg, and it's in a former clinic, which was converted into a cultural centre as well, and is now, I think, a kind of community hub, and has also puts on really great cinema events. They have a pottery, I think, and so it's not it's not on the front line of people who need food and water and stuff, but in different ways and in really different bits of the city have made an effort to demystify and de-scarify, if that's a word, the whole situation.
What do you think is the relationship between government help and volunteers helping here in the UK?
I think this is obviously very much coming from the perspective of somebody who kind of works in the voluntary sector and has a particular view from that, I guess. But I think the support that you get as someone seeking asylum in the UK is very limited, the government support you get. If you're living in a hotel, you might get your meals provided for you, but they're really poor quality, and you get just £9 a week to cover everything else, non-prescription medicines and travel and all that kind of thing. So essentially there's not much government support at all, and so there's an enormous gap, which I think the sort of voluntary sector fills. I think it can be quite an antagonistic relationship at times. I think particularly with the last government that we had, the Conservative government pursuing quite an anti-refugee agenda, so that included like the Rwanda plan and the use of hotels and also the use of certain accommodation sites like the Bibi Stockholm barge or Wethersfield barracks, and I think that did create quite a dynamic of an antagonistic, I guess, relationship between those groups that are trying to support people seeking asylum and the government, which often seemed like they were, perpetuating that hostile environment that has been talked about so much. I would like to say it's slightly more positive under this current government, but I'm not sure that's the case. I think that we're still seeing a lot of very anti-refugee policies still being followed and making the sort of day-to-day lives of people seeking asylum quite difficult. And I think sometimes, the government has a difficult job, I guess, of supporting people seeking asylum here, but I think the responses we get often when we kind of ask questions of the government or the Home Office, I guess, or looking to seek answers, often we don't get the answers that we need, and it feels like we're on two very different sides there, which seems like it's probably not the most constructive or productive relationship to have.
Has that changed? Because I've got an old friend who was a Vietnamese refugee, and she was 8 years old when she came to the UK as a young child, and now is working as a midwife and very much a part of our society and very valued. And I mean, a lot of these refugees must become ordinary people in society and be really, really important parts of the society we live in. So why has that story changed, do you think? Have you got any ideas?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, I hope that, in 20 years' time when we look back at this particular moment of history, that is the case, and that we see people who have been able to build a life here that they feel happy with, and that that they feel a part of society and they feel welcomed here. I hope that's the case. I think that there have been some really incredible initiatives to try and put that in place, from employment programs or just community groups coming together to welcome people, and also just, of course, the tenacity and efforts of people who come here seeking sanctuary and their kind of desire to make their own life and make their own way here. I think we are lucky in the UK too that we have huge diasporas from all over the world here, that people can sort of find people maybe from their own country or find that community here as well. In terms of why it's changed, I don't really know. I guess I can't really comment on what it was like before my time, but I do wonder now that there's such a focus on this kind of the refugee. It's always got a crisis, refugee crisis. The small boats crisis is always kind of framed in those terms, rather than what a wonderful opportunity we have to welcome new people into this country who bring so many things. And I hope that we can move towards that kind of framing in society a bit more, and a more positive and seeing that the benefits of it, rather than constantly framing it as a crisis, which it isn't. It's people seeking safety.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think, it sort of sounds maybe a bit like warm words, but I think the stories that people bring to large cities, regardless of where they are, really make the city, don't they? So I'd really point, there's a fantastic organisation in Berlin called Polyrama, and they collect oral histories of Berliners, many of whom come from a migration background. And there's also a long tradition of Vietnamese people coming to the east of Berlin in the 70s and so on. And Polyrama interview and then archive stories of people from all sorts of walks of life, and then that really broadens the palette of who is a Berliner, I suppose. When it's speaking as a Londoner, I'd have to sort of want to hear that directly from Polyrama maybe, but it certainly broadens the idea of who belongs in the city maybe, and whose stories are valid. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember many years ago, I think, back in the 90s, I worked on a series of films about people who came here from abroad. And one of the biographies I made was about a man named Rabbi Hugo Grin, who survived Auschwitz. And he just spent his entire life bringing people together. That was what he did, and that's what he believed in. And I can't help thinking that it's partly that generation has now passed away, so we've sort of forgotten how awful it can be and that it can happen to us. And hopefully there'll be other cities in the world where we would be welcome if we ended up in that situation. Don't you think? Is that part of what you believe in as well? Or
yeah, absolutely. I think there's such this idea that people think the refugees are so different to people who are already living in the UK, or that there's like a real lack of understanding or a willingness to listen to people.
I was wondering if you have any particular stories that you've heard from people who've come here as asylum seekers that have really struck you.
That's a very good question. I feel very lucky to hear so many stories of the people that we meet and know. I think some of the stories are like very difficult stories that people share of their journeys here or the reasons why they left their homes in the first place, but also then really positive stories about what people have been able to do here. I'd never want to sort of, speak for people, but just being able to share some of the things that people have told me. I have become friends with a man from Syria, I think he's in his 50s now, who is a dentist, and he's now I think practicing dentistry again in the UK, and his family have been able to come over. So really positive stories of people being able to sort of make their homes here. But also some friends I have that came over as when they were children, so unaccompanied minors coming over who, didn't speak any English when they came here. They had really no sense of what was going on or what they had access to, who've now been to college and got jobs and have their own houses, and being able to watch someone find their feet in that way has been really lovely.
Have you got any particular stories of people that you've encountered who've really affected you?
I think a few in Berlin and a few in the UK, and I think the one thing I've really noticed is how messy the lives are of people who've left their home countries. So there is a tendency, just going back to your point, Sydney, about overall the media narrative is pretty negative about asylum and so on, and it really misses, apart from being really provocative and it brings out often the worst in people, it's also just very untrue, because people's lives are, even whatever circumstances they've left whichever country, their journeys are messy, the choices they've made, moral or practical or whatever, are generally often quite messy, and I think there's a lack of willingness sometimes to look that in the face. And so the stories I've heard when I've got to know people are when they made the decision to leave their country. Sometimes they've literally had no choice and just grabbed a bag and run, but often it's been the most excruciating choices they've had to make. I'm thinking of Syrians in particular, where the Syrians that were arriving in Germany in large numbers in 2015 by and large left travelling by sea briefly and then on foot. The finances involved to make those journeys were different than Syrians that ended up on being resettled to the UK. To get to the UK, they had to prove more that they were vulnerable to get through the paperwork, essentially. And you get this sort of the things that people leave behind. And I think that's where, if you think of cities as resonant as London and Berlin, but really any older city, then those people's lives add to the mix of other complex lives. I mean, one particular example has stuck with me, which is of a Ukrainian. I met a lot of Ukrainians in Berlin who had talked about whether to take their pets with them. And that really brought home to me. It's sort of, you think more about guns and bullets and whatever when you leave a war zone, but I was really struck by, it's mainly older women who were leaving Ukraine at the time, who brought dogs and cats with them so several days on a train. They knew they were short of a fairly warm welcome when they got to Berlin or got to Germany, but they were still bringing with them what they could carry. And I used to do a lot of dog walking in the evenings, because it was mainly dogs were absolutely going out of their minds because they'd been cooped up in a dog basket for several days. And that's really third order compared to making sure people get sleep and food and warm clothing and whatnot. But it stuck with me a little bit. And I think I was stupid enough once or twice to ask people why they'd actually brought their dog with them, given that they could have brought more stuff with them. And of course people were like, well, it's my dog. So I thought it was quite everybody, I've never had to make that choice, and I hope I never do. I don't think anybody talking now has. So those sorts of small choices are just mind-blowing, really.
I think now at the moment as well, I think, with the situation in Syria, there's lots of Syrian people in the UK who are thinking about the idea of what does going back mean, and do they want to stay in the UK? Do they want to maybe return to Syria? And those ideas then of where is home? How there's so much instability in the life of someone who has to, is forced to leave their home, and then being able to then build a life in the UK. And so, it's not a choice a lot of people want to have to make, but then also now thinking, okay, if I've got the choice to maybe go home and what's left for me there. And I think talking about that with people that I know from Syria has been really interesting recently too, and how people are, thinking about their future at this moment.
I was just going back to what I think is a really fundamental issue. What is a healthy relationship between the state and civil society and people? Does it have to be antagonistic? And isn't there a better way to do things? Because in the UK you've got large national charities such as Care for Calais, and then a nice ecosystem of smaller groups. Same in Germany. There's quite a tradition of church-based organisations, and I was again just going back to 2022, but the legacy is still there, and a lot of thinking has been going on about what the next refugee, in inverted commas, crisis might mean for a large city like Berlin. Smaller churches, which I was part of a group run by a lady called Ulrike Meyer, who had brought together and this really showed the difference between 2022 and 2015, because it was purely volunteer based, and then was civil society groups stole a march on the city hall. And initially, when large numbers and this could happen again, because Berlin is still a Eastern European essentially city. So heaven forbid there are more Ukrainians leaving Ukraine, then this is a scenario that people would need to plan for, I suppose. But using sort of just spontaneous organisation, using people's phones, grassroots groups were really quick to mobilise almost immediately. By their own admission, that caught the city hall by surprise. They didn't know quite what to do. There was a period when the two were not really aligned in what they were doing, and the city hall felt, that it was trying to do things at scale, that it would ultimately be the one that would decide on how to spend money on large amounts of accommodation, so prefabricated accommodation, for example, in tents and so on. And then smaller groups were like, we don't have time for this, we've got to really start to house people in Berlin quickly, and then potentially move them on to other bits of Germany where there's more housing. So smaller groups can really open things up until, as I think it's inevitable, a progressive city at least will say, we are the organisation that can do things at scale. We collect and spend people's money. Particularly I'm thinking of sort of utopia maybe where, there's a UK City of Sanctuary movement, for example, which tries to push for more sanctuary, and we have several boroughs of sanctuary in London. I'm thinking of Lewisham and Greenwich and Islington and a few others, I believe. And why don't we just bring all these jigsaw pieces together and get state authorities, initiatives, larger national charities, smaller national grassroots charities, and get everybody pointing in the same direction.
It's interesting. I think that's a similar situation with what's happened in the UK, particularly, both, speaking from my knowledge about what was happening in Calais on the border, but also in the UK, that it's sort of, it's the grassroots that responds quickly. It's the local communities, local groups that kind of quickly start up and are suddenly being able to provide hundreds of coats to people or put all these activities on. And I think that's kind of Care for Calais' origin story really too, of kind of local people who care about their community, who want to be welcoming, springing into action. And I think we're at a point now where I think sort of local authorities, national authorities, or larger charities are kind of catching up now, and it does seem there is a more settled ecosystem of like support for people seeking asylum. So it does seem, I think, a more positive picture now. I think it's obviously that sort of transition from being grassroots groups doing things to sort of it becoming more formalised is always a bit tricky, and there is some sort of the magic of, I don't know, it sounds very sort of soft there, but the magic of sort of community organising being lost in that a bit. But I hope that we're moving to a system now where there is, wherever you are, there is some support that you can access. And I think particularly a city like London, we're a very diverse international city, and there is a lot of wonderful organisations and wonderful support services here that people can access. And I think people from across the world, they know London as a city, people know where London is, and I think a lot of people who end up seeking asylum in the UK want to be in London because that's the sense that London is a multicultural place. You'll be welcome there, you'll find people that you can go to the same churches or mosques as you, and people get quite fearful if they're moved out of London sometimes because they're worried that support isn't going to be there. But I think actually across the country now that those organisations have popped up, and there's people kind of doing good stuff all over the place now, which is nice.
What's the comparative number of refugees in Berlin? Sorry, I've put you on the spot now, Rob. But do you know what the comparative number of refugees is in Berlin versus London?
I don't off the top of my head. I think it is... Of course, you need to distinguish between asylum seekers and refugees. There's also a grey zone in German law, which is called Duldung, which is a source of some aggravation. So this is where you are permitted, it literally means permitted to stay in the country, but are in legal limbo land. And that was, my understanding, that was a bit of a stopgap measure put in place. You're neither a full citizen or somebody who's got refugee status. But I think just to dodge the question on the numbers, but the dynamics are similar to what Sydney was saying about London, because Berlin has, as we heard in the last podcast, an overheated housing market. It is really not a place, although it has exactly the same buzz and reputation within Germany, at least, as London does. Germany's a bit different because it has some almost equally sized cities, which are also very multicultural, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Munich, etc. And although London's obviously got loads of other, the UK has got loads of other multicultural cities as well, the housing dynamics are really different. And there is a dispersal which has got a checkered history in the UK of basically obliging people to leave London, is done more rigorously in Germany. And they have a system called the key system, I think, the Schlüsselsystem, which essentially a spreadsheet which can decide where people are moved to in Germany. And that means that there's a more equal distribution of people. So it's which has, again, pros and cons as well.
I've got one more question, actually. Why is it that refugees are not allowed to work when they're waiting for their outcomes to come through?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there are a lot of groups that have been campaigning against it at the moment. I think the argument from the Home Office would be that it would be almost like a pull factor, I guess, that if somebody is able to work whilst they're going through the asylum system, then it kind of basically creates a sort of, this is not my word, but almost like a backdoor in to come and work in the UK. Other than that, I don't really know, because it does put people's life in limbo for the months or years it takes for their claim to be heard. They are sort of forced to rely on government support in that way, and people don't want to be doing that. People want to be working, they want to be meaningfully using their time and be able to support themselves. And it's very tricky, and it kind of does force people to live in what is essentially sort of relative poverty. And the impact it has on people's mental health as well, of not being able to work, or, you know, if people had jobs or a trade they did before and not being able to do that in this new place can be really destabilising, and just the sort of boredom that people experience of not being able to do anything all day, it's really tricky. So I hope that's something, I think it's something the Lib Dems have definitely been arguing for. I think Labour might have considered it at one point, but yeah, like sort of lifting that ban on people seeking asylum from working, I think would be a really positive step for people.
Are they allowed to volunteer?
Yes, people can volunteer, and we do have a lot of people that support us, but also support other organisations volunteering. So yeah, that's definitely something people can do.
Well, thank you very much, Sydney. That's really interesting, and Rob, for all your knowledge about Berlin, so we can compare the two. And hopefully we'll continue to welcome refugees in our cities. Till next time.
Thank you.
If you're interested in finding out more about the organisations Rob mentioned who are working with asylum seekers in Berlin, the links are in the show notes. Also, if you could like or share our podcast, we'd really appreciate it. It helps us reach more listeners. Thanks, and until next time.